And I would ask you now, witnesses, to leave us so we can go on to our next session. Thank you very much this morning. Have our second set of witnesses joined us?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Alex. Thank you very much. And if I could just check if Dominique has joined us.
Yes, I have joined. Good morning.
And good morning. And Robert Hardy?
Yes, present and correct.
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry for the delay. It's just the first session overran slightly. The committee has got your biography, so they know your organisations and they know about you. So I won't go into the detail of that. This is a live broadcast, as you would have been informed. The transcripts of the session will be sent to you after the session. And if there are any corrections to be made, if you could do the corrections and send them back straight away to us, that would be very, very useful. I'm extremely grateful for you joining us this morning. This is a session, as you know, that we're doing in our report Beyond Tariffs Facilitating UK-EU Trade. And this is a session on customs and logistics experts. So thank you very much, Alex Veitch from the Head of International Policy, Dominic Williams from CAT, and Robert Hardy from Oakland's Invicta. If I may, go straight into asking the questions, and you can incorporate your opening statements within that, if that's okay, for brevity of time. And if you could make your responses to questions quite succinct and short, and to my colleagues, if they could make their questions and supplementaries equally as concise as possible. So thank you very much for coming. And if I may start with you, Mr. Hardy, Robert, in general terms, what will be the main customs requirements and processes for trade with the EU from January the 1st onwards? And if you could cover both exports and imports where you can, from the perspective of the trader and, of course, the freight forwarder.
Okay, thank you very much. In very simple terms, and removing SPS for a moment, the movement of goods from one customs territory to another requires the goods to be zero rated for VAT at export and positive rated for VAT at importation. So you have an export declaration at the country of source, a country of origin, if you like, or the country of dispatch, an exit safety and security declaration that alerts the border that you're coming, the exit border, an entry summary safety and security declaration that alerts the arrival border that you're coming, and an import declaration to complete the transaction, which accounts for duty and VAT. That's it in a nutshell. They're the same in either direction. There is the possibility of a transit document if you're not prepared to clear, or if you're not preparing to clear at the first point of arrival. But aside from SPS controls particularly, that's it in a nutshell. Export declaration, exit summary, entry summary, import declaration. Transit if you intend to move beyond the initial border arrival and clear inland, whether that's arriving in Calais, clearing in Germany, or arriving in Dover and clearing in Northampton, for example. That's it. Once you layer in SPS, it gets far more complicated with export health certificates, an entry on traces, which is the European tracking system, and an entry on IPAFs, which is the UK equivalent of traces. Those documents are required. The Incoterms, which are the commercial terms between the seller and the buyer, will decide who is responsible for those documents. If, for example, something is on a delivered price, the exporter is responsible for the export documentation and the importer the import documentation. But it's not always as clear cut as that. And that's when it has major overlaps into the freight forwarders sector. But in general terms, from a trader's point of view, the process is very clear. And from the freight forwarder's point of view, it's either the trader doing their own process or the freight forwarder will pick up their own.
Thank you. I may come back to you later on if time allows, for one or two obvious questions that have just arisen from your response. If I may go on to Lord Shipley, though.
Well, can I raise the issue of whether customs declarations might be different between circumstances which produce a free trade agreement or whether there's no deal? Customs declarations are going to be required irrespective of the UK and the EU agreeing a free trade agreement. But is there a qualitative difference between customs requirements and procedures that would arise in an FTA scenario compared to a no-deal outcome? And perhaps, Alex Veitch, if you might start with that.
Good morning. Thank you. I will be brief, and other panelists will no doubt wish to add. Yes, there is a difference. One very straightforward difference is that if you have a free trade agreement, which ideally would have zero tariffs on goods between the UK and the EU, for the sake of argument, let's say zero tariffs on everything, that would make customs declarations much easier to do. You would need fewer people to do them. And importantly, we think that you would also have less incentive on the border authorities on either side to carry out interventions, i.e., in our world, inspect trucks, check that they're receiving the correct amount of duty. So yes, we think there is a major difference between FTA or no FTA, even though, as you rightly say, declarations will be required.
So can I just ask you then about the interventions? You said that there could be, in one scenario, greater level of intervention. Could you just say a little bit more about what you think that might amount to?
So I think that there would be, what I'm trying to get across is, why would you want to check a truck? One reason is drugs, guns, clandestine migrants, all the things that we check for today. Another reason is to check that the goods have a customs declaration attached to them, that declaration is correct, that they are not being what they call misdeclared in the customs world, i.e. a very expensive item being declared that it's cheap. So your customs, you're essentially committing fraud. That's why you check it. As well as the other things that I just mentioned. And so if all customs tariffs are zero, there would be, we think, less incentive for the authorities to check trucks. So I'm not saying there would be fewer checks. I'm just saying that there would be less point doing the check, because one of the reasons you do the check is to check for customs fraud. And why would there be customs fraud if everything has no customs attached? So I'm editorializing a bit, but I think it's an important point, because that is one of the major reasons why we check stuff coming through the borders.
Okay, could I ask Dominique Willems and then Robert Hardy just to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Indeed, the least amount of diversion there is from either the duties or rules on the products, the less chance there will be of checks. In that sense, having an agreement that is as comprehensive as possible will help in mitigating those kind of checks. On the other hand, I have to disagree with the fact that if there is a trade agreement in place, the pure operational process of doing a customs declaration becomes more complex and more lengthy, because it has to actually also be proven that this origin is correct and the lower amount of duties can be claimed. And that in itself causes also a certain amount of risk, which has to be mitigated as well, of course. But overall, the chances of having checks are lower if there is more alignment of rules. Next to that, I would like to mention one more thing. It was maybe forgotten, but it was mentioned in the previous session, are these so-called security declarations that have to be done as well next to the customs declarations. This is not about food health and safety or SPS checks. This is about terrorism. It does arise from customs legislation, even though it's not always customs doing these kind of checks. and this is quite intrusive into the actual supply chain or logistics chain, whereas customs declarations can be sort of detached from the physical movement of the goods and the process around it. The safety and security checks have to be done at certain moments in time and can be quite disruptive and cause also quite the amount of administrative burden and alignment and cooperation amongst the supply chain, as different actors have to do different things at different moments in time. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and Robert Harding?
That's a very good point, Dominic, is that deal or no deal, the safety and security declaration is the same unless the need for it is taken away by a deal. Okay, but if that's not covered by the deal, the declaration is the same. In terms of the customs documentation, I'm more inclined to agree with Dominic, I'm afraid, is that I think the customs entry is easier if there's duty. If there isn't duty, you then have a number of qualifying criteria that you have to ensure are met. It's important to remember in Brexit land, unlike today, everything is guilty until proven innocent, whereas at the moment trade flows pretty smoothly unless somebody decides to pull it out of the line. In Brexit, it is fully dutiable. It is subject to all customs control unless you present a document that says that it isn't. If you do present a customs document that says it isn't, then you are into rules of origin, you're into certificates of origin. Likewise, if we previously were talking about customs union, you're into movement certificates. You must remember that everything from Turkey requires customs clearance but very little duty. Everything from Switzerland requires customs clearance but very little duty. The only complication with an entry without a deal is who is paying the duty. That's either on the trader's own account with customs, or the freight forwarder pays the duty and collects it from the trader. But that can cause some friction in the supply chain.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Turnbull.
I want to talk about readiness. This requires a number of players to be ready. The government's got to know what it wants to do and has published that. Customs and border got to be ready. Companies, a much wider range of companies than now, need to understand that regime. And then there's the whole logistics, the border, customs agents, freight handlers, ports, and so on. So the question here, particularly on the logistics part, is how prepared are all these players, and in particular the customs and logistics industry, for the introduction of new customs processes for goods traded with the EU, whether there is a deal or whether there isn't. So we've got 5.5 months left. So how likely is it that all these players are going to be ready?
Can I come in first, Dave? Would you mind? First of all, the relaxations that were announced on the 12th of June with a kind of a move to CFSP and a retrospective declaration, excuse me, for the first 6 months has certainly eased the pressure on the customs intermediary sector. It's not for all goods, but it's for the majority of goods where you have up to 6 months to lodge the first declaration. So that's taken a big swathe of imports out of the process, which leaves us with exports, which is 25% of those are empty, and the documentation for exports is easier, if you like, in terms of the export declaration, but more complicated if you are in transit. Now, any vehicle that leaves Dover is one of three things. He's either empty, he's got a pre-lodged French import entry, which means he doesn't need a transit, or he requires a transit document through to destination. That's the bit that gives me the sleepless nights, because it's the transit. For a transit document to be raised, you must have a transit guarantee, which is able to cover the cumulative total of the VAT and duty which you are moving in transit until they are discharged. And there is the process of authenticating that transit document. So look, the volumes are much less, but the liabilities are high. So the import move, fantastic. There's more chance of being ready. The transit side of it gives me the heebie-jeebies, really, and that's the bit we need to focus on. It always has been the case.
Perhaps if I could come in on the logistics operator side of things, I agree with Robert here about the worry. I think the import arrangements are very helpful, as others have said. We are concerned about exports. So from the point of view of a haulier, driving a truck on a ferry or through Eurotunnel to the continent, or perhaps doing an unaccompanied trailer movement. We need to really understand what the rules are around making sure the declarations have been done by the trader or by their forwarder, and what happens if they haven't been done. What are the obligations on the haulier or indeed the ferry company in some cases? And also, interestingly, what's going to happen at Calais, because we understand that Calais Port are reintroducing the system they prepared for no deal contingency, which would hopefully be a smart system that would allocate a barcode to a driver and let them scan their truck in, which shows that everything's been cleared and they're good to go on the egress side. It would be different if they've got SPS, as Robert has rightly said. So, you know, we do need to look at this export side. We're working with our members. We're talking to Calais. I wonder if Dominique has some insight into this. And also, we need to be talking to other EU partners, the Republic of Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, where a lot of our goods go, to see, look, are there any arrangements at these busy, popular ports which could make the flow of goods out of the UK a little bit easier?
Dominique?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that, first of all, two different groups in terms of preparedness have to be distinguished. The first group is the group of smaller traders, or at least traders with less experience in dealing with these border procedures, and that's the traders. And next to that, you also have then the smaller carriers, especially road hauliers, who are not that familiar with these kind of procedures, or understand the risks that are involved in dealing with customs. So there, I think there is an absolute lack of readiness in the sense that, well, we have seen this in no deal preparations previously as well. It's the unawareness of what is coming makes them also, not entirely preparing for what is coming. The second group is a group of let's say, companies who are more used to this, and this is the group of companies we represent. It's in their core business, but it's also larger multinational companies who are more used to trading in an international environment. And there we have to say that the readiness is as good as possible. I also join a task force of the UK government, which deals with the intermediaries, with the readiness, the practical readiness across on two sides of the channel, by the way. Also the EU customs authorities joined there. And there I can say it's as ready as possible. But with the introduction of new measures in the UK, which seem good, but it makes it also difficult to prepare at this moment fully, because it comes down to small details in IT requirements and procedural requirements which aren't fully known yet. And for that, the clock is certainly ticking. So in order to be fully ready from that professional side, more clarity and more practical approach is needed than just a press release or an overall story of where it might go. We really need to practically prepare also our IT systems for that.
Thank you. Lord Turnbull wanted to come back in.
The government may be thinking that it's got until midnight on the 31st of December to finalise this agreement. But supposing, typically, as in many EU things, that's when the final deal is done, that's not the point at which all these other players can immediately swing into action. They need time then to absorb what was in that agreement and get ready. How much beyond the point at which the deal is struck, how much time do all these players need?
Dominic?
Yeah, sure. That's half a year at least usually. But if necessary, it can be shorter if the information is clear, correct, and it's not the introduction of completely new systems, completely new procedures. Then it would be possible. I mean, we've been ready for 2-3 no deals already, and there was no measures. So a lot of the measures taken there already are still in place. But if you would introduce something new, yeah, that might require half a year at least to be ready. But you have to understand, it's not just these companies getting ready. You also have to go to those I mentioned previously, the hauliers, the smaller traders, who need to understand, who need to have certain information ready. Yeah, that takes time in itself as well.
Thank you. Lord Lilly. Lord Lilly?
Yeah, sorry, I've managed to unmute. We hear a lot of talk about the risk of disruption at Dover and backing up the motorways towards London. But it's not clear whether A, there is such a risk, B, whether it's just a risk during the period of teething troubles when new processes are introduced and traders are getting used to it, or whether there's a risk of such disruption in the long term. And nor is it very clear whether we are better able to cope with that with Operation Brock than we were with Operation Stack, which has come in 10 days a year on average for the last 20 years. So could you tell us what you anticipate? Will there be a risk of disruption in the long term? Are we better coped with it, or is it a short-term teething problem risk?
Okay, would you like me to respond to that?
Like to start?
Sorry. Great question. Thank you. So I think risk is the absolutely correct term to use. I think where we are right now is the risk arises primarily because of the export flows, we think. Because of these, the 6-month additional period of time from the UK side, that is not going to be replicated by the EU. We are certain of that. And so we are doing our best to help mitigate the risk of delays through working with the government and our members and many other business groups and advisors and others to try to make sure we do everything we can to get all the players in the supply chain ready to go from January the 1st with all the export paperwork they need. And I think I mentioned briefly before what Calais Port are doing, and I know that Eurotunnel as well have been doing a lot of work when we had the no-deal contingencies before about ways to make the flow of goods continue as fast as possible. I don't think it would be right for me to say yes or no, there will or won't be short-term delays. There is a risk, and the trouble with Ro-Ro in the short straits of Dover Calais is if you get a delay on the export side going to France, it could quite quickly delay the whole system. It could, I'm not saying it definitely will, but I am confident then in the longer term, once we get this system called the GVMS, the Goods Vehicle Movement System, up and running, flowing both ways, once the Calais system is fully understood and used by all the players in the party involved, hopefully many businesses will sign up to transit procedures, as Robert mentioned earlier. That will really help. Perhaps we can find an easier way to manage SPS as well. Hopefully the Republic of Ireland will develop similar systems to encourage this. I think longer term, I hope we have to really get to the place where goods flow quickly. I think it's a must do. I don't think it's a can do only, it's a must do. We really have to get this going and make it work as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robert?
Mute myself. Sorry. Can I just add one thing to that? There's a fundamental difference between Stack and Brock, and I know you're not claiming that there isn't, but Stack is a linear queue where there is more demand than there is available capacity. Brock is a customs queue, and not all trucks are the same in a Brock queue as they are in a Stack queue. There are 3 types of truck. If they're empty, they don't need to be in the Brock queue. If their transit documents are all pre-authenticated, which they can be up country, they do not need a Dover agent to authenticate or raise the document. They should not be in the Brock queue. Brock is only for the absolutely unprepared. And in all honesty, they need to suffer a little bit. If they don't suffer a bit, they'll never prepare. So there has to be this, trucking companies will always go for the path of least resistance. And whilst they'll hit a brick wall, they won't hit it every time. They'll mitigate that. So delay the unprepared. The biggest challenge, I think, is reward the prepared. How do you recognize a truck that is either empty or prepared before he hits Kent? That's, for me, is the biggest challenge. And when we talked before about truck pop-ups at truck stops, there were 100 pop-ups planned, and I visited a number of these. They were for the unprepared, and we argued with the Border Delivery Group, successfully I have to say, that the pop-up should be for the prepared. You call in and you get your VIP pass, and you miss the Manston queue. And if you want your VIP pass, get your documents in order. Nothing more to say on that.
Thank you, Lord. Lily, did you want to come back? You're muted.
No, I didn't want to come back, and that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Baroness Kramer.
Yes, could I just pick up the issue of costs? Obviously, the costs associated with the new procedures, and just wondered what the witnesses' thoughts would be on mitigating those costs. Are there some things that we can structure into the agreement that would help? And also, I think one of the witnesses talked about future border crossings, those kinds of issues and the impact that they have on the whole cost and complexity. Just wonder what your view is of the benefits of the trusted trader schemes such as the AEO. I'm very conscious from talking to a lot of companies that they have achieved very expensive AEO status, but then find the thing so useless they never actually use it. So just that whole cost issue, I wonder if you could play through that for us.
Could I start again then? Sorry, I don't want to monopolise, but we get a lot. If I had £1 for every time somebody called me and said I need AEO, I wouldn't be doing this. My question is always, why do you want it? And their answer is, I have no idea. It just sounds like a good idea. Look, AEO right now doesn't butter any parsnips, as they say. It's not going to solve a lot of problems. It is good for relaxation on future problems, and it's good for a relaxation on financial guarantees required for certain custom simplifications. But as customs have largely waived those in any case, the benefit of AEO is not quite so strong. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a concept of trusted trader. Now but that doesn't have to be AEO. It can be this CFSP belated entry in declarants records approval. So there are a number of mitigating factors. And I think if we can get simplifications at trader level, whether they're trusted or however we want to phrase them, then yes, you can control the costs because you're suddenly in consolidated monthly returns, which I have to say the larger traders are currently doing consolidated monthly returns. It's called Intrastat, and they all do them, and nobody kicks up a fuss about it. Okay, customs declaration is more complicated than Intrastat, but what we find in a lot of cases is that nobody even considers Intrastat today. So it's double that, but it's not everything. We were asked to price something up recently for a trader, a UK retailer, bringing various products in a consolidated, simplified way. We got to a customs declaration cost of less than a penny a case. So it's doable. It's not necessarily going to mean empty shelves and very wealthy customs brokers, unfortunately.
Dominique?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have to agree in the sense that the declaration itself, the administrative work around it isn't the biggest deal and can be mitigated. AEO as a concept is not useless, I would say, but it's not for the general trader something that will help them. You have to have already quite a substantial amount of processes and costs in place in order for AEO to become beneficial to you in order to start saving costs. So smaller traders will not be helped by AEO, but as said before, AEO isn't the holy grail of trade facilitation either. There are all kinds of ways that procedures can be simplified, as mentioned previously, which is already common practice in the industry for decades, actually. And this could be expanded to mitigate it, but it has to be remembered that this it also doesn't come for free. I mean, these are also authorizations where you have to have meet certain requirements, which is not always for a smaller, and it's certainly not for an incidental trader beneficial to have that. So just doing a customs declaration isn't the worst thing either. It costs a few pounds, and you send over your documents, and usually within the hour it's done. So it's not a big deal either to just do a customs declaration. Costs will be added, but in the sort of the entire cost of transportation, the customs costs are not that much.
Alex, have you got anything to add?
Well, yes, I do. My point of this, and something I'm really keen to land with this committee, is how can we get more British companies becoming trusted traders? AEO is there, as the other witnesses have said, there are several others. You pick and mix, you choose the one that suits you. Now, the HMRC have always been reluctant to give, proactive advice about facilitations. I worked at our HMRC on facilitations, and they are worried about businesses picking the wrong option, perhaps. So they give very generic, bland advice, saying here's what's available. It's given in government guidance speak. It's not really in plain English. One thing we would like government to do is be a little bit more bold, pick out the most important ones. So for my sector of logistics, I would say CTC Transit, because the legal instrument's already there, with or without a free trade deal with the EU. It's really useful, it's really handy. It's worth at least knowing about and looking at. Now, I'm led to believe that HMRC are going to be reviewing their public information to make it a bit more user-friendly, maybe even do some videos explaining what these things are. All that would be great, because the more we can get trucks border ready as they leave the warehouse, the better for everybody.
Thank you very much. Baroness Kramer, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's been just one minor question that somebody might pick up, which is there a real difference for someone who is doing large volume exports of essentially identical product to someone who's doing small exports of very customized things? I'm thinking some of the trucks that go through with consolidated loads of all kinds of different things, with very different characteristics. And I just wonder whether or not the impact is very different and the cost very different for those two.
If I may, I could answer it. Yes, there is a big difference. If you have very large volumes with always the same goods, this is extremely repetitive, and it would usually be automated either entirely or at least to the fullest extent. And in that sense, it's very easy and cheap, but it has to be set up in that case, of course. If there are, let's say, season goods, Christmas goods with all kinds of things coming in, think of a fur Santa Claus who has lights in it and moves a bit. Is that a toy? Is that lighting? Is that so? You have to start figuring that out. If you have 20 different things in one truck, that becomes even more complex. And yes, there is a big difference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Baroness Chalker.
Yes, I'd like to ask Alex and Robert about the reports that government plan to introduce a new IT system to allow for pre-declarations to be submitted. I think it's called the Goods Vehicle Movement Services. How would this operate, and how would it help facilitate the flow of traffic and of goods? And above all, what steps does the government need to take to ensure that this is operational as soon as possible after the 31st of December?
Alex, do you mind if I start with? Oh, sorry.
Yes, go on.
After you, Robert.
GVMS. We first heard of GVMS in February at the stakeholder event at the IOD. So it's been in the pipeline. We love it, I have to say. It's let's not overdress it. It's a travel wallet, and if your documents go in the travel wallet, then you will be allowed to travel. I think in terms of its launch, it won't be ready on day one. But it could be a scratch pad by day one. What I mean by that is that you can just put the document reference into a wallet in order to get a single reference that the driver needs to cross the border, but no validation of those references will take place whilst you're loading the wallet. Eventually, by probably July next year, those documents will also be validated. So at the moment, it's simply a wallet. It's full implementation. It's a smart wallet. But we love it because it's one size fits all. And prior to that, we had Holyhead doing one thing, Dover doing something else, Portsmouth doing something else, and Immingham doing something else. And that's very, very hard to manage. GVMS is a simple system that goes across every port. So thumbs up from us.
Thank you, Robert. Alex?
Well, we love it too. This is a very positive panel you have today. Double thumbs up. This flows perfectly from Baroness Kramer's question previously, because the problem, the really unique problem with RoRo compared to lots of other modes is you have a bunch of stuff in the truck, in the trailer, but it's not always clear what stuff is in the trailer, and then which tractor unit is pulling the trailer. So you need to have all the things in the trailer ticked off in the wallet. You need to know what trailer is on, and you need to know what truck it's all attached to.
Yep.
And actually the truck can change in between leaving the warehouse and going to the port. So you need something that's really easy to use so the hauliers can get their minds around it and can actually be flexible enough to be adapted and changed over time. And from what we know about the system, all those things are possible. Conceptually, we are absolutely 100% behind it. And we are, what we need is the operating manual for this thing. So what do our members need to do and how, by when? And I think it's, we've had good interactions with government on this. They are saying that they will work directly with hauliers that want to set up their own interface through their IT systems to make it work, or you can use it through the government gateway. We're just getting into that level now. And I think we are hopeful, I would say confident, this thing will be fully operational when it's supposed to be, which is July next year. We understand that it will be in operation in a more limited sense from January, which will be another good opportunity to trial it. But the sooner the better. We're really behind it, and let's make it happen.
May I just come back briefly, Chairman?
Absolutely.
What can we get you to do, or get you to recommend us to say, to make the first 6 months of 2021 a little smoother than it might be, since the system won't be fully ready?
Well, I've got to say, I think the government's been, look, the government's point of view on this is they can control what they can control, i.e. their borders. I would love to see the government also helping the logistics and the other sectors understand, are there any specific arrangements on the EU side that could help? So, we are speaking to Calais Port. We've got some briefing materials we'll be delivering to hundreds of members this week on like this. I would love if Border Protocol Delivery Group and others could engage really closely with the French and indeed from the Republic of Ireland and get that material and help us develop training packages for all the UK businesses that need to know it. So I think it's doing what they're doing. They're doing a good job. I don't want to be critical. I'm not going to be. But it takes two to tango. We need to understand what the clever RoRo procedures are going to be from January, when all these declarations will be required and will be checked on the continental EU side and in the Republic of Ireland. That's what we could really use a hand in. So any gentle nudges in that direction would be appreciated from my point of view. I'm sure others would like to comment too.
Thank you for the magic word, training.
Well, could I just add, I mean, if you want to take one thing away to say to the government, look, make sure this will work. I hate going on about transit again, but it's all about transit. About 80% of the loaded trucks leaving UK will be in transit. That's actually not a European system. It's not a UK system. It's a common transit convention system, okay, which if I had a reference number for a transit document now from anybody, I can check whether it's valid. I just call it up on the system, put the MRN in, and it will tell me. Focus on that, because you can validate that one, even if it's manually, even if it's the duck on the pond with the feet going like crazy, but it looks good. Then do, even if it's manual in the background, validate the transit. Because the French have said before, if you arrive in Calais with a transit that hasn't been validated at the office of departure, we're sending you back. Okay, that you can't raise the document in Calais, they'll send you back to Dover. And then you'll be trying to work your way back up to Manston.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Alex.
Thank you. Can I go on to Lord Lamont?
Thank you very much. Could I ask about so-called customs intermediaries, freight forwarders, customs brokers? Is there going to be a huge extra demand for them in this new situation? Are they adequately trained? Do we have enough? And is there enough time to do more training of them?
Who are you directing it to, Lord Lamont?
Well, I'm not sure which witness, whichever witness wants to reply.
Shall we start with Dominique?
Okay. Yeah. So, well, we do represent about 19,000 of these companies across Europe. That includes the UK. In the UK specifically, I don't think that we're there yet in terms of the capacity which will be needed. Although it is difficult to estimate fully, but okay, we don't think that will be ready entirely. The problem is that in terms of the grants, which are very much appreciated, of course, but they stimulate the education, which is possible at a very low entry level customs clerk, but an experienced person would take about 2 to 3 years to educate that person. So any new person coming in could only start at the very basic level. But the main issue is not so much in education. It's also making people interested in going to this profession, where efforts could maybe increase a little bit more. I've seen also, of course, due to COVID, there are a lot of people who are without a job. But as you might understand that no child grows up saying that when I grow up I want to be a customs clerk. So people have to be made a bit enthusiastic to get into this profession as well. If we were to get at a level where it's sufficient to deal with the upcoming declarations, and you have to understand it's not just Brexit. The amount of declarations will also increase due to new VAT rules on e-commerce products. Which is a huge increase of hundreds of millions of customs declarations extra. And so it's not just for Brexit that these people are needed. There is much more going on where this is already needed. So some extra help on getting kids to say that they want to become a customs clerk would be great.
Alex, Robert?
Well, one of the problems, I mean, I grew up in Dover, so that's one of the things that you did, and you did actually go to school and get trained to be a customs clerk. But it was an industry, and maybe it will be again, but there's constantly the axe swinging over you, where you are working to simplify and handle the processes and train new staff, where there are a whole bunch of politicians trying to make sure you're not needed, because we are going to oversimplify things. I mean, somebody said to me about Brexit, I said, I've been training for 30 years for Brexit, because the processes that stopped 30 years ago are pretty much coming back. It's quite, if you concentrate only on European customs clearance, you can train people very quickly. The government grants in terms of recruitment covered a quarter of the starting salary of any new recruits, plus the recruitment cost, better known as 3 months. So look for a surge in the increase in the number of recruits in September for the end of the year, because that's a zero cost to the customs broker. Previously, they've not employed, not because there's not been the demand, but because the date keeps moving and nobody wanted to pay for bringing people in, laying them off again, and so on. Now the date's fixed, and there is a grant that covers the last 3 months. Expect a surge just after the summer.
Yeah, if I may quickly add something to that, indeed, there is also the factor of the entrepreneurial risk of hiring those people, having staff, having a place to work for them, yeah, we have had several situations in the past 2 years where eventually nothing happened. So it's also a matter for many companies to wait until the very last moment to make sure that they're ready. Where they're, yeah, if the entrepreneurial risk would be covered more instead of just the education, that would ensure that the capacity is there at the right moment as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Have you got anything to add?
One build on that, please, is you know, there's a bigger policy question here about how you unlock funds to train and upskill people in logistics and customs, and we have a campaign running to amend the apprenticeship levy to become a skills levy. And we've had direct feedback from many of our members who work in this space to say, if I could release apprenticeship levy funding for vocational courses, like customs courses, I would do it. So I would really encourage the committee to consider whether there is a related policy ask here, as we would phrase it, around amending their apprenticeship levy scheme to release business funds to vocational training, such as for customs and indeed other areas of logistics and many other sectors more widely.
Lord Lamont?
No more questions.
Thanks very much. Lord Berkeley.
Thank you, Chair. I'd first of all like to ask Dominique about the transit. Many of you have discussed transit this morning, but transit through a non-EU country in Switzerland, there's a very large amount of freight goes by road and rail through Switzerland. Have we got any lessons to learn from that when we're considering transit from the Republic of Ireland to the continent through the UK? And secondly, which maybe Alex could answer, or one of the other, or everyone, is the availability of drivers and the road haulage, the worries about where the drivers will come from, and whether the ECMT permits will work, because it's my impression at the moment that sort of a very large proportion of the drivers of the trucks actually are based in Eastern Europe. And how will that work? What's the best way of making that work after we've left the EU? Thank you. Dominic first, maybe.
Okay, thank you. On transit, well, I said before, the Common Transit Convention, that's something that really works well. It's not just something, by the way, that works by itself. This requires certain measures by the government, but certainly also by the traders themselves. If you want to make transit a success, again, you need quite a range of authorizations for customs to enable possibilities where from your own premises you can either send or receive goods without customs interference. That's actually possible. But you can understand that well, you need an authorization for that. There is also a guarantee required for it. And you have to manage that process, of course, because once goods go into transit, especially to outside of the customs territory or inside, or they come from outside, there is a risk of if the procedures are not fulfilled correctly, that duties and taxes have to be paid. So yes, it certainly provides a very good way of moving goods across the border, but that requires certain preparations and awareness of the existence of that by the traders or the companies themselves. And in that sense, the UK doesn't have that transit culture, if I may call it yet, where in other countries like Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, it's very common to move goods standard away from borders through customs procedures. This hasn't been the case that much in the past in the UK. So there is a certain learning amount to be learned there still. But it is certainly a very good solution to move goods across the border without having any stops, or actually without having any customs interference at all in certain cases. On the drivers, I don't think there will be necessarily there is an overall shortage of drivers, But well, because of Brexit, I think there will actually be a little bit less need, especially in the beginning. And as far as the ECMT permits go, yeah, we've discussed this actually last Friday also with our members. And the main conclusion there was that the measures that were taken already or that were announced already for a no deal situation were actually sufficient and would be a good way forward in this case as well.
Thank you. Alex?
So I'll talk about the permits issue first, if I may, and then come back to the drivers. So, you know, permits are the worst case scenario, and to be avoided if you can. So the only reason that you would have permits is if there is no, first of all, no free trade agreement, which should really be called a free trade and transport agreement, because the idea of that is it includes air and road freight transport within it. If there's no overarching FTA, we'd like to see a separate agreement on road freight and indeed on air as well, of course, to make those things work. Lord Berkeley, just for your interest in rail, it's a little bit different. There will be a bilateral on rail between the UK and different member states to make that connectivity happen. So just to...
well, thanks, Alex, but there's no rail to Ireland, all right? Forget that.
That's true, okay. That's a fair point. It's still important. Anyway, now I disagree with Dominique entirely about permits. He's not correct on that. If you have the base level of permits permitted under the regulation, there would be not a sufficient amount allocated to the UK. I'll provide this to the committee, if I may, separately, some documentation on this. But the UK's allocation, assuming all the UK trucks are Euro 6, i.e. the most stringent environmental standard, would be just over 2,000 trucks on a given year. So this is not enough for UK hauliers. It may be enough for EU-based hauliers to access the UK, but that's not quite the same thing. So this is a worst-case scenario. I don't want to paint too bleak a picture, however, because we would be hopeful that even if the permits system needed to be used, there could be an agreement between the UK and the EU to provide a higher allocation than that. So it's, you know, we're not quite at the worst case scenario before, but I can tell you, under the no deal contingency, our members were starting to bid for permits and being turned down. So please don't leave this hearing thinking it's all fine, because it isn't.
If I may quickly, I agree with you that ideally there would be an agreement in place. But if the question was, as I understood it, in the sense with ECMT, is it workable? Yeah, the least amount workable it would be. But I agree with you that ideally there is an agreement on this.
Could I ask Alex to submit a short paper on that to the committee if he's able? That's very, very interesting from both of you.
Yes, of course. Just quickly on drivers, yes, there is a shortage of drivers. We are, again, hoping that if we can get some changes potentially to the apprenticeship levy funding, that would help. Driving at HGV is an attractive career opportunity, and we're hoping that we will be able to attract more people to our sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Inglewood.
Thank you, Chairman. We've touched on this a little bit. Risk of stating the obvious, there's two sides to every border. And what do our witnesses think about the possibility or risk that there might turn out to be more checks on the far side of the UK-EU border, which would disrupt the goods between the two areas? And given the possibility, what, if anything, should the government do to mitigate the risk of that? I don't know who'd like to start. I mean, whichever of you wishes first, really.
Well, I don't mind jumping in if that's okay. And we're talking about so vehicles leaving the UK and arriving in mainland Europe and being delayed. But look, if they're delayed in mainland Europe, it's because something's wrong. Either the transit document's not been authenticated, or the anticipated entry isn't there, or it's SPS that it requires veterinary checks and so on and so forth. SPS at most would be 15% of the traffic. So we're talking about around about 15 trucks on a ferry arriving. And really what the government has to try and do is make sure the remaining that aren't SPS, that are given every possible assistance so that they don't fall foul of the checks in Calais. i.e., are you border ready? Are your documents right? And GVMS is that massive step in the right direction. Our advice to everybody is don't start a journey unless you can finish the journey. So it really is a kind of play the whole backwards kind of process. That if you can't get there, don't set off for there. Okay? So and it comes down to transit again. If GVMS can be hooked up to transit, you're going to cover an awful lot very quickly.
Alex?
Yeah, I think there's one other case where delays might arise, though, and Robert, feel free to disagree. But border authorities will do risk-based interventions depending on whether they think there is a risk of smuggling, to put it bluntly. So you might get delayed because you might be one of the unlucky few that get pulled out for a check, and that may be done on a high sample rate or a low sample rate. So it's very difficult to predict what delays that might cause. But we certainly anticipate risk-based checks taking place to ensure that not only that the paperwork's in order, but that there's nothing funny going on in terms of misdeclaration of goods and so on. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced, I think, than Robert said. But for the most part, I agree. I think perhaps Dominic may know more about the kind of interventions that we might perhaps see on the EU side.
Dominic?
Yeah, sure. Well, on the EU side, as mentioned before, these are, but it's the same for the UK. Currently, these are targeted checks, so it's not that all the goods will be checked at the moment they arrive at the border. You're talking about overall of all goods, the amount of checks is on about 5%. Although, as mentioned before, the trade between the UK and the EU is a lot in agricultural products, and that requires extra checks. I don't think that the EU has that much interest in necessarily doing additional checks, other than if a specific risk would be seen. So I don't expect that there will be in overall terms an increase, or that there will be said, okay, we're checking these goods extra because they come from the UK. Yeah, the best way to mitigate those kind of delays or checks is, on the one hand, to ensure that there is as many at least as amount of steps as possible. So coming back to the safety and security declarations of the beginning, that leads to another extra moment or 2 or 3 extra moments again to do a check. And this is on UK soil, because these declarations have to be sent to the EU, and then you get a response back. There has to be a check, yes or no, before the goods are even loaded onto the vehicle. But yeah, also in that sense, it's important to keep in mind that these authorizations and simplifications are used to the maximum extent possible. This helps checks do not have to be done at the border, but can be done inland, or as I mentioned before, with the simplified transit procedure, where checks can be done at the trader's own premises. So this would help mitigate. And lastly, yeah, of course, the more the rules on products or other things are aligned, the less reason there is to do a check. So these 3 things I would add to this discussion.
Robert, did you have anything to add?
No, I think if you're comparing with today, I don't think the number of checks will increase. It's again, if you get the paperwork right, you won't get those number of checks. Look, if you sit in the roundabout at Dover today and see vessels arrive or trucks arrive from the continent, nobody knows what's in them. We just know they were good enough to pass through the continent, so they're good enough for us. There's a bit of that going on. I mean, the check-in, will it be more than today? Potentially, but I don't really see it.